The Desert Rose Motel sat like a forgotten relic against the endless Arizona landscape, its faded pink stucco walls baking under the relentless Flagstaff sun. Neon signs buzzed and flickered intermittently, casting sickly light across the cracked asphalt parking lot where tumbleweeds gathered like conspirators in the corners. The air hung thick with dust and the metallic scent of rust, while somewhere in the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another night of ozone-charged winds. Diane Carver stood behind the reception desk, her weathered hands gripping a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. At 53, she carried herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing other people's problems. Her graying hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her pale blue scrubs, a remnant from her nursing days, had faded to the color of old bones. She watched through the grimy window as a dusty pickup truck pulled into the lot, its engine coughing like a dying man. The driver who emerged was young, maybe mid-20s, with intricate tattoos covering his arms like a roadmap of poor decisions. Chris Valdez moved with the restless energy of someone who had been driving too long, his dark eyes scanning the motel with the wariness of a man who had stayed in too many places like this. He pushed through the glass door, setting off a discordant chime that echoed through the empty lobby. "Need a room for the night," he said, sliding a crumpled 20 across the scarred Formica counter. Diane's fingers hesitated over the registry. "Book. Any particular preference?" Cheap and quiet. Her pen wavered for a moment before she wrote 309 in careful script. She slid the key across the counter, an actual metal key, not one of those plastic cards. "Third floor. Elevator's broken, so you'll have to take the stairs." Chris pocketed the key without looking at the number. As he headed for the door, Diane called after him. "Try to get some sleep before midnight. Place gets active after that." He paused, one hand on the door handle. "Active how?" But Diane had already turned away, busying herself with paperwork that didn't need her attention. Room 309 sat at the end of a long corridor that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and something else, something organic and unpleasant that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Chris wrestled with the sticky lock for a full minute before the door finally gave way, opening to reveal a space frozen in 1983. The carpet was burnt orange, the bedspread a nauseating pattern of brown and gold flowers. But it was the mirror that dominated the room, a massive thing mounted above the vanity, its silvered surface reflecting the room with an unsettling clarity. As Chris dropped his duffel bag on the bed, he noticed something odd about his reflection. It seemed to lag slightly, as if the mirror was a second behind reality. He shook his head, attributing it to exhaustion, and headed for the bathroom. 3 floors below, Rosa Martinez pushed her cleaning cart down the first-floor hallway, trying to ignore the way Mr. Heller's door cracked open as she passed. At 17, she had already learned to make herself invisible, a skill that served her well in her undocumented status and her new job at the Desert Rose. She could feel his eyes following her, but she kept her head down and continued working. Jonas Pike sat in the security office, surrounded by monitors that showed empty hallways and the parking lot where heat mirages danced on the asphalt. The ex-cop's paranoia had only gotten worse since he'd taken this job 6 months ago. He'd started seeing things in the cameras, movement where there shouldn't be any, figures that appeared for a single frame and then vanished. Tonight felt different, though. The storm approaching from the west carried an electric charge that made his teeth ache. In room 309, Chris had discovered something wedged behind the vanity. Using his pocket knife, he pried loose a folded piece of paper, stained with what looked like dried blood. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "Don't use the mirror after 3 a.m. Whatever you do, don't look into it. She's waiting. She's always waiting." The woman with the slashed throat. She knows what happened here. She knows what Diane did. If you see her, don't listen to her whispers. Don't let her tell you the names. Once you hear the names, you become one of them. MK, July 15th, 1993. Chris stared at the note, a chill running down his spine despite the desert heat. He glanced at the mirror, but his reflection stared back normally now. The digital clock on the nightstand read 11:47 p.m. Downstairs, Diane was doing her final rounds, checking locks and turning off unnecessary lights. She paused outside room 309, pressing her ear to the door. She could hear movement inside. Footsteps, the creak of bed springs. Normal sounds. But she knew better than anyone that normal was a relative concept at the Desert Rose. She remembered the summer of 1993 when the air conditioning had failed during a brutal heat wave. Temperatures had soared to 118 degrees, and several elderly guests had been suffering. As a nurse, she had watched them deteriorate, their bodies unable to cope with the extreme heat. What she had done next still haunted her dreams. Room 309 had been her makeshift hospice, where she had eased their suffering with morphine stolen from the hospital where she used to work. She had told herself it was mercy, but the law would have called it murder. The room remembered. Somehow, impossibly, it remembered every death, every final breath, every whispered prayer. At 2:47 a.m., Chris was wide awake, staring at the mirror from his position on the bed. The note lay beside him, and he found himself unable to look away from his reflection. There was something hypnotic about the way the mirror seemed to pulse with its own inner light, like a heartbeat made visible. The clock ticked to 3:00 a.m. At first, nothing happened. Chris almost laughed at his own foolishness. But then, slowly, his reflection began to change. The image grew paler, thinner, and behind his own face, another began to emerge. A woman with lank hair and a throat opened in a grotesque smile, blood still fresh on her pale skin. Her lips moved, and Chris heard his name whispered in a voice like wind through broken glass. She began to speak other names: Margaret Kim, Harold Weston, Dorothy Chan, Samuel Torres, a litany of the dead that seemed to go on forever. With each name, Chris felt something cold wrap around his heart, squeezing tighter. In the security office, Jonas watched his monitors in growing alarm. The cameras in room 309 showed only static, but the hallway camera revealed something impossible. Chris was standing outside his own room, perfectly still, staring at the door. But Jonas could also see the light under the door, could hear the faint sound of someone moving around inside. Two of him, Jonas whispered, his hand reaching for his radio. But as he watched, more figures appeared in the hallway. Different versions of the same man, all standing motionless, all facing room 309. Rosa, working late to finish her assigned rooms, dropped her cleaning supplies when she saw them. 7 figures, maybe 8, all identical, all perfectly still. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Got inside room 309. Chris was screaming, but no sound emerged from his throat. The woman in the mirror was showing him things now, images of the future playing out like a movie. He saw Jonas climbing the stairs, saw the night security guard's face twist with recognition as he realized what was about to happen. He saw his own death playing on an infinite loop, and understood with crystal clarity that this was his fate, had always been his fate from the moment he'd written his name in Diane's registry book. The mirror began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface. With each crack, one of the figures in the hallway collapsed, dissolving into shadow and regret. By dawn, only one Chris remained, sitting catatonic on the bed, his eyes reflecting the same empty light as the shattered mirror. When Diane found him, she wasn't surprised. She had seen it before, would see it again. The desert rose had an appetite, and room 309 was where it fed. Jonas never made it up those stairs. He was found at the bottom, his neck broken, his eyes wide with terror. The security footage showed him falling backward down the steps at exactly 3:17 a.m., as if something had pushed him, or as if he had seen something so horrifying that his body had simply refused to go forward. The mirror was replaced within a week, but Diane knew it wouldn't matter. The room remembered everything, and mirrors were just windows into memories that refused to die. She updated the registry book, crossing out Chris's name with a red pen, and waited for the next guest who would ignore the warnings, who would look into that mirror after 3 a.m. and discover that some reflections show not what is, but what was, and what inevitably must be. In the desert heat, the Desert Rose Motel continued its silent vigil, and room 309 waited patiently for its next occupant, its next memory to collect and preserve in the endless gallery of the damned. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the snow as Chris pulled into the Lakeshore Motel's parking lot. The neon sign flickered erratically V, Can Y, half the letters dark against the blue-tinged night. Beyond the building, Lake Superior stretched like a frozen wasteland, its surface invisible beneath the endless white dot. At exactly midnight, the man at the front desk said, "You never checked out in 1984. Welcome back." Chris stared at the gaunt figure behind the counter. The nameplate read Diana Woman's name, though the person standing there looked neither distinctly male nor female, just weathered by too many Minnesota winters. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Chris said, stamping snow from his boots. "I was born in 1985. Diane's fingers, pale as birch bark, traced down a yellowed guest register. Room 14. Christopher Novak. Check-in January 5th, 1984. No checkout recorded." Those hollow eyes looked up. "Your bill's been accumulating interest for 41 years. The heating system groaned like something dying. Chris pulled his coat tighter. "Look, I just need a room for the night. The storm's getting worse. And this was the only place with lights on. Room 14. It is then." Diane slid an old-fashioned metal key across the counter. Same as always. The room smelled of cigarettes and something else, something sweet and rotting. Chris dropped his bag and immediately went to the thermostat. The needle was stuck at 55 degrees. He twisted the dial, but it wouldn't budge. Through the thin walls, he could hear voices. An old man's gruff complaints about waiting, a woman's tired sighs, the distant sound of someone moving furniture. At least he wasn't alone in this frozen tomb. Sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, Chris walked down a hallway that stretched impossibly far, doors numbered in sequences that made no sense. 14, 237, 14B, 1984. Behind each door, voices whispered in languages he didn't recognize, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing, sometimes screaming. He woke to find frost covering the inside of his window, and his breath visible in the air. The next morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the snow fell heavier, and the single plowed road leading to the highway had vanished beneath white drifts. Chris found the other guests in the motel's small lobby, huddled around a coffee pot that occasionally sputtered to life. Mr. Heller sat in the corner armchair, his fingers blackened with what looked like severe frostbite. Despite the injury, he seemed oblivious to any pain, just staring out the window with rheumy eyes. "Waiting for my wife," he said when Chris approached. "She went to get cigarettes from the gas station. Should be back any minute now." "When did she leave?" Chris asked. "Tuesday." Mr. Heller's voice carried no uncertainty. "Always comes back on Tuesday." Rosa, the part-time cleaner, emerged from a supply closet looking shaken. She was a small woman with calloused hands and worried eyes that darted constantly toward the hallways. Something's wrong with the layout. She whispered to Chris, I've been cleaning this place for 3 years, know every inch of it. But this morning, there's a hallway behind the ice machine that leads to 6 more rooms. Rooms that aren't supposed to exist. Jonas, the delivery driver, laughed bitterly from his position near the radiator. Lady, nothing about this place makes sense. I came here to deliver supplies yesterday, and now my truck won't start, my radios. Picking up broadcasts from the 1920s. And that snowplow I called? Dispatcher says they have no record of this motel existing. Diane materialized behind the front desk as if she'd been there all along. Gentlemen, lady, the storm will pass. It always does. Until then, you're welcome to enjoy our hospitality. How long do these storms usually last? Chris asked. Diane consulted the guest register, though Chris noticed she wasn't actually reading it. Oh, varies. Sometimes a few days. Sometimes longer. Mr. Heller there has been with us since 1973. Still waiting for his wife. Mr. Heller nodded. Agreeably, his frostbitten fingers tapping against the armrest. By afternoon, the temperature inside had dropped to barely above freezing. The lights flickered constantly, and the old radio in the lobby whispered fragments of conversations, stock reports from 1929, weather warnings from 1978, a disc jockey announcing songs that wouldn't be written for another decade. Chris decided to explore. The hallway Rosa had mentioned was indeed there, branching off behind the ice machine like it had always existed. The carpet was different here, gold and brown, in a pattern that screamed 1970s. The room numbers followed. No logical sequence. 23, 198, 14C, infinity. He tried the door marked infinity. It opened. Inside, the room was identical to his, except everything was reversed. The bathroom, on the left instead of right. The window showing not the frozen lake, but a summer scene with children playing on a beach. The guest register on the knit stand was filled with names in various handwritings, all dated July 15th, 1962. His own name appeared on line 47. When Chris returned to the lobby, Rosa was frantically cleaning the same spot on the floor over and over. Found something terrible, she muttered without looking up. Room 237. Door was locked from the inside, but I had the master key. Inside there were bones. Old bones arranged in a circle around a birthday cake. Candles still burning, even though there's no electricity in that wing. Jonas grabbed her shoulders. What wing? Rosa, this motel only has one wing. 20 rooms, that's it. Check the blueprints then. Rosa pointed toward the front desk. Ask Diane about the renovations, about what happened in the early 90s. But when they turned, Diane was gone. The guest register lay open, pages flipping in a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. Chris approached and saw his name written dozens of times across different decades: 1984, 1967, 1998, 2003, and dates stretching into the future. 24/6. Christopher Novak. Cause of death? Hypothermia. That evening, the 5 of them sat in the lobby as the storm raged harder than ever. The windows rattled so violently that Jonas had pushed furniture against them, convinced they would shatter. This isn't natural, he said, pacing between the barricaded windows. Storms don't last this long. And that road, I've been watching all day. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Like reality keeps changing its mind. Mr. Heller spoke up from his eternal vigil. This motel is a loop. You don't leave, you just change decades. I figured that out around 1981. My wife, she's not coming back from any gas station. She never left. Neither did I, neither will any of you. That's insane. Chris protested, But even as he said it, he remembered the guest register, the impossible rooms. The summer window in Winter. Rosa had stopped cleaning and sat hunched in a corner. I found more rooms today, dozens of them. Some had guests, not bones, but actual people. They looked right at me, but didn't seem to see me, like they were living in a different time. She looked up with hollow eyes. One of them was me. Older. Me, maybe 20 years from now. She was cleaning the same spot I clean every day. The radio crackled to life. This is KDLH Duluth, bringing you the weather for January 15th, 1984. Heavy snow expected to continue indefinitely. Travelers are advised that some roads may never reopen. In other news, the Lakeshore Motel reported 5 missing persons today, though local authorities found no evidence of foul play on the third day, or what felt like the third day. Chris found the locked room. He'd been systematically checking every door in every impossible hallway, and this one had no number at all, just a brass plate that read, Office. The key from room 14 fit perfectly. Inside. Diane sat at a desk covered with guest registers from different eras. She looked up as he entered, and for the first time, she smiled. You found it, she said. Most guests take much longer. Mr. Heller still hasn't figured it out. What is this place? A way station. A fold in time where moments get stuck. January 15th, 1984. That was the first time you died here, Christopher. Froze to death in room 14 when your car broke down during a blizzard. But death isn't always permanent in places like this. Chris felt the temperature dropping around him. Saw his breath forming clouds. So I'm dead? You're between. They all are Rosa, Jonas, Mr. Heller, even me. We're all people who died here on different dates, in different decades, but somehow the same moment. Time got confused, started collecting us. How do we leave? Diane gestured to the window. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, revealing not the frozen lake, but dozens of different landscapes, summer beaches, autumn forests, spring meadows, winter wastelands, all existing simultaneously. You don't leave. You choose when to stay. Pick your favorite moment, your preferred decade. Some guests prefer the optimism of the 1960s. Others like the technology of the 2020s. Mr. Heller chose 1973 because that's when he was happiest. Chris understood now why his name appeared in the future guest register. And 2046? The year you finally accept that checkout time is forever. Through the window, he could see his fellow guests in different time periods. Rosa cleaning floors in 1955. Jonas delivering packages in 1967. Mr. Heller waiting for his wife in an endless loop of Tuesdays. The storm had stopped. Outside room 14, his car was running, engine warm, tank full. The road back to the highway was clear, but Chris knew that if he drove away, he'd only end up back here again in the same moment, making the same choice. He looked at Diane, then at the guest register where his name waited to be written one more time. What happens if I stay? You become the desk clerk, she said, standing up and walking toward the door. I've been here since 1961. Long enough. She handed him the pen. Welcome to the Lakeshore Motel, Christopher. Checkout time is forever, but the coffee's always fresh, and there's always someone new to meet. Outside, another car's headlights cut through the eternal snow, pulling into the parking lot where the neon sign flickered its half-hearted welcome. Chris sat down behind the desk, opened the guest register to a fresh page, and waited for the next guest to discover what he'd learned. Time, like the storm, never really ends here. It just finds new ways to fall. That afternoon, Chris met Jonas Wilde, a contractor Diane had hired for renovations. Jonas was a practical man in his 40s, built like a brick wall and skeptical of ghost stories. But even he seemed unsettled by the motel's atmosphere. Bin. Working on the electrical system, Jonas explained as they stood in the hallway outside room 111. But the wiring doesn't make sense. There's power running to sections of the building that don't exist according to the blueprints. He gestured toward the blank wall, like right here. Should be nothing but exterior wall, but I'm picking up active circuits on the other side. Chris showed him the digital recordings from the previous night. Jonas listened with growing concern as the woman's voice called Chris's name through the static. That's impossible, Jonas muttered, but his certainty was cracking. Look, I've got some tools in my truck. What do you say we take a look behind this wall? Just a small hole. See what's there. They waited until evening, when Diane retired to her quarters and the motel settled into its unnatural quiet. Jonas used a small drill to create a pilot hole in the drywall, and immediately a strange odor wafted out, not the expected smell of insulation and dust, but something floral and cloying, like roses left too long in a closed room. Jonas widened the hole with a utility knife, and Chris shone a flashlight through the opening. What they saw defied explanation. Beyond the wall lay not empty space or building exterior, but a fully furnished room larger and more elaborate than any in the motel. Victorian furniture filled the space, a massive canopy bed with moth-eaten curtains, a marble-top dresser, and walls lined with photographs in ornate frames. But it was the photographs themselves that made Chris's blood run cold. They showed the current guests of the Magnolia Inn, but aged by decades. There was Rosa, her hair white as snow, her face deeply lined with age. Mr. Heller appeared even more gaunt, his clothes hanging like burial shrouds. And there, in the center of it all, was Chris himself, but 30 years older, his hair silver, his face marked by lines that spoke of long years and terrible knowledge. In each photograph, the subject's eyes held the same expression, a mixture of desperate pleading and hopeless resignation, as if they were trying to warn the viewer of some approaching doom. Jonas stumbled backward, his face pale. This isn't possible. I surveyed this building myself. There's no room here. The exterior wall is less than 6 feet away. As if in response to his words, the temperature in the hallway dropped noticeably. The antique furniture seemed to shift and breathe in the shadows, and from beyond the wall came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching the hole they had created. A woman's face appeared in the opening, her features beautiful, but wrong somehow, as if viewed through water or distorted glass. Her lips moved soundlessly, and then her voice filled the hallway, seeming to come from everywhere at once. You found us. You shouldn't have found us. Now the room knows you're here. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the blackness, Chris heard Jonas scream a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly, as if he had simply vanished from existence. When the emergency lighting kicked in moments later, Jonas was gone. Only his tools remained scattered on the floor, and the hole in the wall had somehow sealed itself, leaving smooth, unblemished drywall as if it had never been disturbed. Over the following nights, the motel began to change. Hallways stretched, longer than they should, leading to corridors that hadn't existed the day before. Doors appeared where walls had been, opening onto rooms that defied the building's architecture. The antique furniture multiplied, filling every available space with pieces that seemed to watch the remaining guests with carved wooden eyes. Rosa found her grandmother's voice growing stronger, more insistent, warning her that the building was waking up and remembering how to be hungry. She tried repeatedly to leave, but each morning found her back in her room with no memory of how she'd returned. Mr. Heller grew more agitated, pacing the halls at all hours and muttering about the room's appetite. It's been sleeping for so long, he told Chris during one of their increasingly surreal encounters. 24 years of slumber, but now it's stirring. It remembers what it was like to be full. Chris's own room became a prison of impossible geometry. The walls stretched and contracted like breathing lungs, and the photographs he'd seen in the hidden room began appearing on his dresser, first one, then several, showing him aging day by day, his face becoming more haggard, his eyes more desperate. The 19th night, as Chris sat paralyzed with fear in his chair by the window, he heard his own voice calling from beyond the wall, but older, more tired, carrying the weight of decades of imprisonment. "Don't fight it," his aged voice whispered. "The room with no door doesn't let go. It just gets hungrier and hungrier until there's nothing left but the waiting." The last photograph appeared on his dresser that night. It showed Chris as an old man, standing in a hallway that stretched into infinity, surrounded by countless other guests who had never left the Magnolia Inn. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure that might have been Diane, but her dead stare was now filled with an ancient, satisfied hunger. As dawn broke over Savannah, the Magnolia Inn settled back into its deceptive, quiet Spanish moss swaying in the humid breeze. But inside, in rooms that existed and didn't exist, in corridors that led everywhere and nowhere, the guests continued their endless stay, growing older day by day, feeding the hunger of a room that had no door and no way out. The Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the ancient oaks lining Plantation Road, their twisted branches reaching toward Chris Martinez's rental car as he navigated the cracked asphalt deeper into Savannah's forgotten outskirts. The GPS had lost signal 3 miles back, but the crooked red sign advertising Magnolia Inn vacancy was impossible to miss. Even in the dying light of dusk, Chris pulled into the gravel lot, his travel blogger instincts already cataloging details for his haunted motels of the South series. The 2-story building sagged like a tired old woman, its white paint peeling in long strips that revealed the rotting wood beneath. Humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, carrying the scent of mildew and something else roses, perhaps, though he saw none blooming in the overgrown garden beds. The front office door chimed with a brass bell as Chris entered, and he found himself face to face with Diane Beaumont, the proprietor. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and a smile that didn't quite reach her pale blue eyes. Her southern drawl was honey-sweet, but something cold lurked beneath the surface politeness. "Welcome to the Magnolia Inn, sugar. You must be Mr. Martinez. I have your reservation right here." Her manicured fingers tapped against an old leather-bound registry book. "I've got you in room 111, just down the hall and around the corner. It's one of our finest." Chris accepted the brass key, noting its unusual weight. "Room 111? That seems like an odd numbering system for such a small place." Diane's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, we've had some renovations over the years. Numbers get shuffled around, you know how it is." She gestured toward a faded floor plan mounted on the wall behind the desk. "Your room's on the first floor, nice and quiet." As Chris studied the plan, he counted only 10 rooms, total 5 on each floor, numbered 101 to 105 and 201 to 205. No room 111 appeared anywhere on the diagram. When he turned back to ask about the discrepancy, Diane had vanished into the back office, leaving only the lingering scent of gardenia perfume. The hallway stretched longer than the building's exterior suggested it should, lined with doors bearing tarnished brass numbers. Chris passed 101, 102, 103, then turned the corner as Diane had instructed. The corridor continued, though according to the floor plan, he should have reached the building's end. Antique furniture filled small alcoves along the walls. A Victorian settee here, A mahogany writing desk, they're all covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested they hadn't been disturbed in years. Room 111 sat at the very end of the hall, its door identical to all the others except for one detail. The wall to its right was completely blank, with no door to room 112 or any other chamber. Chris inserted the key and stepped inside, finding a surprisingly well-appointed space with a four-poster bed, an ornate armoire, and heavy velvet curtains that blocked most of the evening light. He was unpacking his equipment when he first heard them muffled voices coming from beyond the blank wall. The sounds were indistinct at first, like a conversation heard through water, but as night fell and the motel settled into quiet, they grew clearer. A woman's voice pleading, a man's angry response. Then, cutting through it all, a scream that made Chris's blood freeze. The sounds came from directly beyond the wall, as if there were another room on the other side. But Chris had walked the entire perimeter of the building during his initial survey. There was nothing but empty space where that room would be. He pressed his ear to the wall, and the voices stopped abruptly, as if sensing his presence. In the sudden silence, he heard something worse. Footsteps pacing back and forth on the other side, accompanied by the soft scraping of fingernails against drywall. Sleep proved impossible. Chris spent the night sitting in the ornate chair by the window, his digital recorder running, capturing hours of intermittent sound sobbing, whispered conversations, and once, around 3 a.m., a woman's voice calling his name with desperate clarity. Next morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere. The humid air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, and the antique furniture in the hallway appeared to have shifted positions slightly, though Chris couldn't be certain. In the breakfast room, he encountered his fellow guests for the first time. Rosa Delacroix, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and worry lines etched deep around her eyes, sat alone at a small table by the window. She looked up as Chris entered, her expression fearful yet relieved to see another living person. "You're in 111, aren't you?" she asked without preamble. "I can tell by the look in your eyes." "You heard them too." Chris joined her at the table, noting how her hands trembled as she lifted her coffee cup. "You've heard the voices?" "Every night for a week now. My grandmother's voice, clear as day, coming through the air vent in my room. She's been dead 15 years, but I'd know her voice anywhere." Rosa leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "She keeps telling me to leave, to get out before they realize I can hear. But when I try to check out, something always happens. My car won't start, or Diane can't find my bill, or ... She trailed off as footsteps approached. Mr. Heller, a gaunt man in his 70s with wild white hair and clothes that had seen better decades, shuffled into the breakfast room. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "You found the room," he said, settling at their table uninvited. "I used to live there, you know, back in '99 before they sealed it. A beautiful place, really bigger than any of the regular rooms, with a view of the garden and everything." His laugh was bitter as ashes. Course, that was before the accident. Rosa and Chris exchanged glances. "What accident?" Chris asked. The Pemberton family stayed in that room for a week, said they were passing through on their way to Florida. "Sweet. Little girl, maybe 8 years old, always playing in the hallway." Mr. Heller's eyes grew distant. Then one morning, they were just ... gone. All their belongings still there. Beds slept in, but no trace of them anywhere. Diane had the room sealed up that same day. Said it was water damage, but we all knew better. Before either could ask more questions, Mr. Heller stood abruptly and shuffled away, muttering under his breath about hungry rooms and doors that shouldn't be opened.